Well, thanks everyone. Uh, I'm glad to be speaking with you uh, this morning, since you're an hour behind um, East Coast time. So, Oscar Micheaux uh, was a passion of mine more than 40 years ago when I first came to the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. It was the first job that I had coming out of graduate school. Spent a few years there, good years there. And one day, uh, I went to a used bookstore in town, and they had this a book called the Conquest, um, and I saw it was about this guy named Oscar Micheaux, someone I'd never heard of. So I asked the owner of the bookstore, about the book, and he said, "Oh, that's a book that somebody had in their collection. It's this black man who came here through here selling books, and somebody bought it, and now we have it on sale." So I bought it and took it back and read it, and I thought it was fascinating. It was a story of a black homesteader in South Dakota, something that I did not know, and so I began to investigate it, do a little preliminary research, and became more intrigued, as I continued to find out about Micheaux. Um, then I looked at the inside of the book, first couple of pages, and I noticed that it was published by the Woodruff Printing Company, that in fact was located one block from University of Nebraska Lincoln. So I walked over there, and there was an older gentleman, there, and I just flat asked him. I said, "I'm looking for any information that you may have, or anyone here may have, about this author, Oscar Micheaux." And he said, "Oh, I remember Oscar Micheaux." He said he came in here asking me about publishing a manuscript that he had written. And so I told him, "Okay, yeah, I think we can do it," and then gave him a price. Said, but 2 weeks later, Micheaux walked into his office with what we would call photo camera ready copy of the book, and gave him the money and asked him to print 500 copies. And so that's kind of, bowled me over, that in the early 1900s, that there was a black man like Micheaux, not only who was a homesteader, but also had the wherewithal to not only publish, self-publish a book. I mean, there were other people publishing, but not in South Dakota, black people, but also to order a certain number of copies, of the book that he then came back and picked up. And then I asked the guy at the Woodruff Printing Company if he knew what happened to Oscar Micheaux and the books and everything. And he said he asked him, Micheaux, how was he going to sell these books? And Micheaux said, "I'm going to take them on the train, and I'm going to sell them myself." Who idea of someone doing that, especially an African American in the early 1900s, is just mind-boggling. It really is. So I became very, very, interested in Oscar Micheaux. Right? About a year later, I was contacted by the National Endowment for the Humanities. At that time, what we now know as PBS was entitled the National Endowment for the Humanities public station. I was contacted by them to see whether or not I would come up to Sioux Falls to record, be on a program that was going to be recorded featuring ethnic writers, and a very famous writer named Ralph Ellison, who published the kind of seminal novel, Invisible Man, I had met in Chicago. He liked me, and so he started, he didn't like traveling, and he refused to fly. And so where places that he didn't want to go, he would tell them to call me, and that I would go and represent him. I mean, I was 26 years old, and got this famous author sending me, around. So I stuck out my chest, beat my chest and everything. And I got on the plane and went to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and recorded the program. And while I was there, I started asking around, with people there about Oscar Micheaux. And I met one lady, older lady, who indicated, yes, she remembered Oscar Micheaux. She said he was a nice guy. And she had a store, something, and that Micheaux would come to the store, and she would always have her child, I think her daughter, sometimes at the store. And Micheaux would spoil her daughter. He'd give her candy and stuff like that. And then he'd bounce the girl on his knee and, that kind of stuff. And she had very fond memories of this, this black man. So I became really, really intrigued with this figure. And as I learned more, and more, about him, I came to understand that I had stumbled, upon one of the seminal figures in the African American intellectual and historical tradition. And as seminal as he is for us in African American life and culture, he's also very important in South Dakota history. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes. I don't believe in giving long lectures anymore. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. And so I'm going to give you some of the basics, and then you can open it up and we can have more of a discussion than you sitting around listening to me talk. Oscar Micheaux was notably, everyone agrees, he's the first African American independent filmmaker. But very few talk about the way that South Dakota figured very prominently in Micheaux's development, in his work, in his his economic outlook, and his program for what at that time began to be known as racial uplifting for people of African descent. Micheaux was born in Metropolis, Illinois, on January 2nd, 1884. He was one of 13 children, the son of Calvin S. and Belle Micheaux, who were born into slavery in Kentucky. Once freed, they moved to Metropolis, Illinois, where Oscar Micheaux was born. And his family bought an 80-acre farm where they grew wheat and corn. Micheaux left home at 16. He dropped out of school. Apparently, he was a very good student, but found the school system boring. I mean, it's kind of prefiguring, I guess, what a lot of our kids these days find, that the school system was boring, what he was learning was not challenging, et cetera. And so he dropped out. He left a few years later, moved to Chicago, where he worked some odd jobs around Chicago, shoe shiner, things like that. And then finally ending up as a Pullman porter. That was a plum job for an African-American male, at that time. And the route that he was on took him from South Dakota all the way over to, Oregon. So, they're traveling that route. And it was while traveling the upper Midwest and the Northwest as a Pullman porter that Micheaux became interested in purchasing land in South Dakota. So in 1904, he traveled to South Dakota to participate in a lottery run by the General Land Office. That was the administrator of the Homestead Act. to allow people to purchase homestead lands on the Rosebud Reservation. But with more than 100,000 homestead claims for only 2,400 available homesteads, Micheaux initially was not able to purchase one in the lottery drawing. He then hired a land locator for $80, and in 1905 purchased a relinquished homestead of 160 acres in Gregory County. And then later on, he purchased even more land. Now, these relinquished homesteads were interesting. The whole idea of relinquishing a homestead, a lot of these homesteads were actually bought by wealthy people in the Northeast who were looking for ways to expand their enterprises and to have land, maybe even to have vacation properties and various things such as that. They were purchasing these properties, this land, sight unseen. And then when they would get on a train to go see what they had purchased, and they saw the land in South Dakota, they were immediately turned off. As you know, there's just a little difference between land in South Dakota and New York City, right? Just a little bit, right? Just a little bit. Okay. So Micheaux, let me back up here. So there was a provision in this policy, the law, where one could purchase the homestead, and then if they didn't want it, didn't like it, they could relinquish it, and it would kind of go back on the market. And so Micheaux hired this land locator. $80. That's a lot of money in 1904. In 1905, he hired this land locator, and then he purchased this relinquished homestead in Gregory, County. I had always wondered what drew Micheaux to South Dakota from Chicago. And I think, though, there's no historical records that can prove this, but here's what I believe, that Micheaux had been drawn by two things. First, there was an earlier successful African-American named Norvell Blair, who had been born into slavery in Tennessee, and in 1882 sent two of his sons to scout out homesteading opportunities in Sully County, South Dakota. The sons came back with a favorable report, and then 7 members of the Blair family moved then to South Dakota and filed homestead claims. They were followed by a number of other Black people who also filed homestead claims and became homesteaders. This group established a Black homesteader community that became known as the Sully County Colored Colony. They had 22 homesteads that totaled between 7,000 to 8,000 acres. And so there was already in the humanities, we call it a trope, kind of a structure there that had become pretty well known about this group that had come to South Dakota and had been able to buy land and to establish, a community without having to deal with many of the problems, namely violence, that other Black people who were trying to do the same thing throughout the South had run into with the Ku Klux Klan. The second thing I think that influenced Micheaux to buy land and look at South Dakota was in 1904, the year that Micheaux filed for a homestead claim. Booker T. Washington delivered the commencement address at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I was really amazed at this when I was at the university. Someone told me that Booker T. Washington had delivered the commencement address there. And I knew that Booker T. Washington had a program that he was, trying to push. He even tried to get it approved by Congress and failed because other Black leaders didn't really want what Booker T. Washington was trying to propose, which was the founding of all Black states. How do you solve the race problem? Well, separate out the races. And Black people could then move to these states where they could have their own economy, their own schools, their own, businesses, et cetera. Of course, that did not go well because other Black leaders were afraid, and rightly so, that if you got all Black people in, say, 3 or 4 states, it would make it very easy to commit genocide, against them. So Washington then turned to the settlement of all Black towns. And he came through the Midwest and the upper part of the South, advocating the settlement of all Black towns. And at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, in his commencement speech, he emphasizes education for African Americans, settlement of all Black towns, development of Black businesses, et cetera. Standard Booker T. Washington program for what was called in the 19th, coming into the 20th century, racial uplifting, because Washington said in his autobiography, Up from Slavery, that Black people coming out of slavery were like a race of 12-year-olds coming out, and the problem they had was they were dependent on the federal government. And so what Black people needed to do was to move from dependency to independence, and the basis of that would be economics. So Micheaux was impressed, as many others were, with Booker T. Washington. In fact, he was so impressed that he dedicated his first novel, The Conquest, to Booker T. Washington, and he gives Washington a nod in his first film, The Homesteader. These two influences on Oscar Micheaux, I believe, contributed significantly to the drive that he had to, in fact, become the kind of business person that he actually did become. He's really quite successful in business. The Homesteader, him as a homesteader wasn't as successful as he had hoped. And there were reasons for this. Number one, he was the only Black person homesteading in this county. So he knew almost nothing about being a homesteader, although he had grown up on a farm. But homesteading was completely difficult. So his first year as a homesteader, however, he plowed 120 acres of land. The land that he and others had bought in Greene County was undeveloped. It was untilled, it was just flat out land, right? And other people who had bought land were having difficulty trying to get it plowed and, developed and all that. Micheaux plowed 120 acres before his white neighbors were able to plow even half or two-thirds of their properties. And so Micheaux, who when he first came to his homestead, was seen as a comic figure. All indications are they thought he was a joke. He was out of place, and they played little jokes on him, right? Some of us think, and I've always thought that they tried to sabotage him, but it's kind of the dark jokes by selling him defective equipment, like plows that didn't work, that kind of stuff that were broken, horses and mules that were old and sickly. They brought them to him at night so that he couldn't see them and all that. And he quickly wised up, to it. Don't bring me these things at night. Bring them during the day when I can, and I can check them out. But his ability to plow 120 acres won his neighbors' respect. In fact, the National Park Service has a little segment on Oscar Micheaux in which, and I quote, they say he won their grudging respect, then to acceptance, and finally to admiration when they realized that he had broken many more acres of prairie than most of them. By 1910, Micheaux had expanded his land holdings to 500 acres and had a modicum of success as a homesteader, but a 3-year drought destroyed his crops. He went to Chicago during this time, before the drought, actually, and published a number of articles in the primary Black newspaper there, the Chicago Defender, encouraging other Blacks to become homesteaders and farmers. In 1910, he married Orlean McCracken, who was a school teacher and a daughter of a minister from Chicago, but when he traveled for business purposes, she felt abandoned and wrote to her father that, she didn't like being alone. And Micheaux was leaving her alone for long periods of time, weeks and that sort of thing. And her father then turned against Micheaux. This was even made worse by the fact that she suffered a miscarriage while Micheaux was away from home for work purposes. Her father, who didn't approve of her on the homestead alone, traveled then with his family to South Dakota and brought her back to Chicago while Micheaux was away. Her father then also sold some of Micheaux's property and took the money for himself. Now, how the father was actually able to do that, I have absolutely no idea. Right? I'm assuming that he was able to do it because his daughter and Micheaux were in fact married, and the property was and then became legally also hers. Micheaux went to Chicago when he discovered that his wife had left. He tried unsuccessfully to get his wife back along with his property. That didn't work. It was unsuccessful. This led to their divorce in 1917. And before then, he had started suffering a number of foreclosures on his property between 1912 and 1914. So the story of Micheaux as a homesteader is a mixed bag. On the one hand, he was very industrious. He had stepped into an arena for which he was ill prepared, but became kind of successful and won the respect, of his homesteading neighbors. But then things came unraveled for him, right, in terms of homesteading. As a result of this, Micheaux turned to writing about his life experiences, which culminated in his first book. It was entitled The Conquest, published in 1913. Which is a book that I just mentioned that when I started talking that I bought at this used bookstore. He paid the Woodward Printing Company in Lincoln, Nebraska to publish his novel, then sold it door to door by traveling by train throughout the Midwest and the South. Right? He took some of the money he made from selling his first novel to pay for printing his second one, The Homesteader. And then after that, published 6 more novels with his own publishing company entitled the Western Book Supply Company. Okay. And Noble and George Johnson, who in 1916 had founded the second African-American film production company, the Lincoln Motion Pictures, knew of Micheaux's self-published novels and approached him for permission to turn them into movies. Micheaux found the idea intriguing, but after discussing this with them and realizing he would not have complete creative control, he decided to form his own film company, the Micheaux Film and Book Company. He secured some investors, hired actors, etc., and began producing his first film, The Homesteader, that he had published in 1917, the book, right, and released the film in 1919. And over his career, he directed and produced more than 40 films. Many of them are lost. Some of them have been decayed and, et cetera, because they weren't preserved effectively. They were existing in some sort of warehouse when I was first working on the show. I wanted to write the book. I had the contract to write a book on the show, but there were so many documents, filmed missing, and that sort of thing. Until his memoirs, his archives were missing, that I abandoned the project when I left University of Nebraska and moved to Cornell University. So 17 of his films were missing, and about another 10 or 12 of them were in very bad condition. One of my students, at Cornell, knew that and had met Oscar Micheaux's nephew. I don't know if you know upstate New York at all, but upstate New York in Ithaca, it's composed really of 4 different hills. Here in South Dakota, you would call them mountains. And the hill across from where Cornell University is, exists a college named Ithaca College, which is a two-year college. Oscar Micheaux's nephew was a student at that college. So I asked my student if he could kind of give me the hookup, so to speak, as young people say, with Oscar Micheaux's nephew, introduce me, and see whether or not I could get my hands on the papers, of Oscar Micheaux that the young man, his nephew, had told my student that he had and his family had. And so we scheduled a date when I was going to meet with this young man to get those documents. 2 days before that date, I'm home watching Black entertainment television, and they had an inaugural program to establish the Black Film Society that later on got the name changed to Oscar Micheaux Film Society. And they're going through this and then giving people awards and that sort of thing. And then they said, well, we have a special guest that we want to acknowledge. We have the nephew of Oscar Micheaux. And so I watched this young man walk across the stage with a couple of guys behind him, pulling like a, little wagons, yes, with crates in them. And he comes up and he starts speaking and he said, well, I think my family wants to donate Oscar Micheaux's papers and all of that to the Black Film Society. Uh-huh. This was 2 days before I was supposed to meet with him. So, I wanted to jump through the television, right? Yeah. So then about a week later or so, I called. I couldn't get anybody, the Black Film Society. And finally, I asked some of my friends who were in Oakland about it. And they gave me some numbers. I called, and everybody I called told me I need to call somebody else. And then somebody said, you need to write this person. Long story short, I never heard anything from anybody. And so I abandoned the project because I just didn't have the documents, that I needed. And several years later, in Texas, 17 of Oscar Micheaux's films were discovered in a warehouse that had been abandoned. And so, for a man of this magnitude, not only in terms of his book publishing, but the tremendous story that involves him in South Dakota, and then the film company to have his work just kind of very ignored, this way, so that it just, went into a state where much of it was not really usable, at that time, was really impacted me, greatly. Nonetheless, some of the films have been restored. We have his books. In fact, when I was in Louisville, Kentucky, in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, I met a man, became quite friendly with an older gentleman, black man. And I just started talking about Oscar Micheaux for some reason, right? And he said, "Oh, yeah, I remember Oscar Micheaux." I said, "You do?" He said, "Yeah, he came to the door. He came to the house and rang the doorbell. Well, I knocked on the door, rather, And when I opened the door, he said, there was this tall black man, well-dressed, et cetera. And he had all these books. And he asked me if I would buy one of his books. And I said, I wanted to help the black guy, this guy out. And so I bought one of his books and he autographed it for me.
Oh, my.
I have that book right here. One of my prized possessions, an autographed copy of The Wind from Nowhere by Oscar Micheaux. And as I began to talk to other folks, about it, a lot of people remembered Oscar Micheaux, and they all had the same story. He would show up, knock on people's door, go into people's businesses, and carry his books and try to sell them, that way. So with Micheaux, we have the business side of Micheaux, right? From the South Dakota homesteading, the book publishing company, getting his film company, starting, securing investors, et cetera, producing all these films. But we also have the side of Micheaux that's so culturally important within the African American tradition, because over his career, Micheaux is so important because he felt himself charged, literally called in a religious sense, to correct the misrepresentations of people of African descent that had been permeating American culture. I remember now in 1905, Thomas Dixon had published a novel entitled The Klansman that was literally a defense of the Ku Klux Klan. And then years later, the book was made into a movie called Birth of a Nation that played to sold-out movie houses across the country. In fact, President Woodrow Wilson, who saw the film, gave it a kind of a presidential medal and said it is like history written in lightning. And so these images of people of African descent, as if black people are a danger, black people are animalistic, you can't trust them, they are coming to take our place, all that kind of stuff, right, was permeating American culture. Micheaux argued against these stereotypes in his movies that had been promoted through minstrels and the developing movie industry. Micheaux's characters were professional people. They were upwardly mobile people of African descent. They were medical doctors, they were lawyers, they were teachers, they were politicians, they were workers, they were business owners, et cetera. And in 1928, Micheaux was forced to file for bankruptcy, but 3 years later, he was able to get new financial investors and reorganize. He was the only black film producer to survive the end of the silent film era. Made his last film in 1948, and then he died of a heart attack in North Carolina in 1951. He was survived by his second wife, Alice Russell, who was also his business partner and a featured actress in his films. Now, here's what I find so significant as well about Micheaux. The Homesteader, which was released in 1919, was adapted from his novel of the same name, featured an all-black cast. Right? Now, this was extremely important because until this point, black people were only allowed to have roles in plays and also in films if they fulfilled and played stereotypical characters. They were like background characters. They were never the main character. Right? And if there was anyone who's going to die in the film, the first person who was going to die was going to be a Black character. So Micheaux featured an all-Black cast. Right? As an independent Black filmmaker, he started his own production company, again, Micheaux Pictures Incorporated, which he founded in 1918. He's credited with the first sound film titled The Exile in 1931. He put a great deal of effort into financing and making, his films and movies. Micheaux was very significant in what became known in the 1920s and the 1930s as race movies. These movies were intensely, very, very popular with people of African descent, right? For the reasons that I've already mentioned. Micheaux made movies across every genre of filmmaking: musicals, comedies, westerns, romances, gangster films, including themes such as African Americans passing for white, interracial marriages, legal injustices, etc. And the roles played by African Americans in his films were a far cry from the stereotypical Uncle Toms and Mammy portrayals viewers were used to seeing during the early 20th century. Black actors in Micheaux's films played the roles of, as I mentioned before, professional, people who were three-dimensional characters, not stereotypes. They had families, they had hope, they had dreams, they had ambitions, they had problems. And so, although he received criticism for giving lead roles to very light-skinned African-American actors, nonetheless, his films gave a particularly important window into Black life and an African-American perspective, on race. So Micheaux was very significant, very important, and what lots of people who write on Micheaux, since I've written on him, don't take into account is the fact that Micheaux not only was a great filmmaker, he wrote, his novels aren't great novels, but they are significant, important novels. I'm an English professor as well. And so, I look at the novels from the perspective of literary criticism, and then I can tear them apart. They're not, what we might consider to be great writing, et cetera, but there was strength and very, very important writing and important novels at the particular time in which they were written. And now, in terms of a historical document, they are very, very, significant. But what a lot of people, most, in fact, who've written and talk about Micheaux, do not take into account were the lessons learned in South Dakota, the experiences Micheaux had in South Dakota, the opportunity that he was given in South Dakota as a homesteader, and of course the tragedy that eventually occurred where he lost his properties and all that sort of thing. So Micheaux was a great man, right? But a lot of his success I credit to the lessons that he learned while in South Dakota, and also the influence of Booker T. Washington. Thank you.